Pixie, Marius, and Vanya just won the major 2 FNCS, but how? Let's look at their incredible strategies from their off spawns to how they play height and the new Tarp they are using that makes their endgames way more efficient. They start off their game by landing at flooded frogs, and Marius would quickly loot around the surrounding splits. This sets themselves up incredibly strongly with cap metal, tons of extra heals, and fantastic guns. From here they made these massive ramp towers to look for Surge. And speaking of that, let's take a look at my notes for how they play Surge. Oh. Yeah, to be honest, there isn't much to learn here. Just like every other team in this Grands, they really aggressively traded Storm Surge, but the legitimacy of this strategy is way too broad of a conversation for this video. Towards the later half of day 1, they were surprise conned by Gripey, Prax, and Glubshe, and they dealt with it by quickly taking a 50-50 and then collapsing on the final 2. This meant that the fight didn't drag out into a stalemate, which would ultimately reduce their Surge potential via opportunity cost. To be honest, from here, their mid games were fairly simple. They benefited greatly from the good zone RNG, and when the zones played away from them, they would simply drop into the zone and find a clean timing to get into the 5th zone. On the partial zones, they were really strong. They often would early rotate through the dead side of the zone and position themselves in priority rotation positions by playing off the edge of the zone. This puts them ahead of the teams around them, meaning that they can easily make the first rotate. They often rotated the partial zones through the center, avoiding all of the congestion along the edge. This works because as most teams rotate into the partial zones, they stop right on the edge. As a result, there are often large clusters of players on the most direct route into the zone. If you instead cut into the center of the zone, you avoid these players for a much easier rotation. The partial zones are also a very key part of the game to deal with Storm Surge. Vanya, Pixie, and Marius were often pushed by teams desperate for Surge, and they played these fights perfectly. They did a great job of letting the fights come to them and not giving the aggressing player any Surge to maybe get above the threshold. This forces the aggressive team to overcommit, often giving them incredibly free refreshes going into the endgame. Moving on to the endgame, the high ground was this team's bread and butter. If they were stacked on the 8th zone, they would often try to take the high ground right there. They would confidently establish themselves using a lot of materials to make pressuring them hard. If they didn't get it in the 8th zone, they would keep trying. In game 9, they quickly got to the front side of the 9th zone and sprayed back. High ground was way too high up and on the back side of the zone, and it was a free take. In game 11, they couldn't get it until later on into the end game, as early on in the end game, they tried to spray out the high ground, but were quickly awareness checked from a team below them. Vanya, Pixie, and Marius didn't tunnel vision on the high ground and backed off for a minute. Then they played it back in the 10th zone, and when the 11th zone pulled, they triple flanked the high ground from in the zone with their gold splashes. Once on the high ground, they had a fairly simple but effective strategy. On the first moving, they made a wide metal cone tarp across the entire zone. This gave them tons of connection points and made it very hard to chop them out, and made the high ground look very confident, further reducing any height takes. They made it even harder to chop themselves out by making sure that they dropped off the height with the baseball bats to connect themselves to teams below them. Once their height was comfortably established, they looked to spray aggressively on the 10th zone on the second height teams by making these little cut-ins from their main height tarps to improve their angles. As the game came closer to an end, Pixie and Marius became much more aggressive on the tops of the second height teams. At times, they arguably got overly aggressive, resulting in them going down, but this is just a part of their high-risk, high-reward playstyle. This extra pressure made new height takes almost impossible, and it scuffed the rest of the lobby below them, reducing their heal-off potential. Meanwhile, Vanya was just chilling on high ground, and when the game ended, he almost always had the most heal-off, which allowed this team to take home 4 victory royales on the weekend. But what about when they can't get the high ground? On the mid ground, this team was definitely weaker, but showed some interesting flashes. Vanya did a great job of keeping this team on safe layers, and they were really good at finding refreshes together. They played side by side, which helped a lot with converting refreshes and allowed them to get off revives late into the game, as if one player goes down, the other 2 are right on them. The other thing that this team did on the mid ground, which was really effective, is that they used this ramp tarp. By placing a ramp, floor, and 1 wall, they were able to safely and quickly get through the zone while using way less materials than a full tarp. Back in chapter 2, teams used to use these tarps all of the time as they were the most material efficient, but they were slowly phased out because they are very easy to pressure and are very hard to find refreshes from. These problems still exist, but Vanya deals with them by sparingly using this tarp when he and his trio know they aren't going to be staying in the same spot, but also need full cover. These tarps shouldn't be the only way you tarp endgame, and it wasn't for this trio, but this ramp tarp should definitely come back into your arsenal as a tarper, as there are plenty of times where it can be effectively used. Although this team won FNCS, I want to point out a few areas where I think they can improve. The first is their teamwork and rotations. Oftentimes, they are too separated in the endgame, and it allowed them to get picked off in unnecessary ways. The second is their low ground looked fairly weak. For example, in game 3, Pixie and Marius find a refresh, and they waste a lot of time healing instead of claiming the front side of the low ground. This allows them to get cut off on the low ground, which ultimately leads to their death. Overall, Pixie, Marius, and Vanya are a really strong team in EU, and are, in my opinion, the most talented team in EU. If they can continue to improve their small micro choices, they can easily win another FNCS and maybe even globals. Make sure to like, subscribe, and use code PhoenixLey in the Fortnite item shop.